Thanks for letting me know.
You're welcome. You're so welcome.
Yes, I do. Very good. Yeah. Now, I would have thought that would
Yes, yes. I thought I recognized you from a very, very long time.
I'm mine.
yes, very.
I'm mine.
And he was a big state.
It really does. I'm taking myself down with that.
And you teach summer.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
So
so
I
I
took lectures for graduation.
I think we're over on it.
Solid chance. Huh?
You to stand. We need you to stand. Yep. Should be recommended.
I sure am. I should.
Right in the middle,
Yeah.
and ask him questions about his process.
Let's get down.
Okay, you're gonna let that sit.
We'll figure it out.
You were feeling. You're really trying to encourage students. How do you do it without just your.
How do you say this? Your great idea is your body.
Yeah, we certainly would. Or you're right, it's great, but I have no idea. We will see. Okay.
So,
Yeah.
Or she kind of like cheated.
Yeah.
Or they make us like that. And they kind of make it straight up. Yeah. Oh, you're gonna be here. Yeah. But there wasn't like.
It's 4:22.
Yeah.
This is
Thank you. Thank you. The call right here is
His dog, his over.
I think we're fine for chairs.
Really?
Okay, bring the chairs. That is turn your chairs away. Now just turn your chairs away. Nine months. I wasn't
Better to speak out.
Remember those people who were again?
Yeah.
That's okay. Stuart, very good. Yes. They're coming down, they're standing upstairs. That's the face of this.
I mean,
You can sit right fine and we're not naturally.
they were talking about this other August.
I can sit.
I was like,
Yeah.
I was trying to find a really nice way to say it. I was like, and everyone was you know, none of us were surprised. But it will be, I mean,
So it's we have to.
technically, the first meeting with the only three of us. But then other things that they wanted to say. I think it's so complicated. You gotta sign up. But also in a
I've had a couple students. Our awful number is 15, so it's not easy. Unless the number you want, you take it to.
But let's get to one of this.
That's true.
I mean, we had a especially video graduate session.
It was actually great. My last shutdowns.
First generation.
I did get the reading in.
They managed to pressure to scratch up.
So they're already signed up to NAPS. I don't know how that goes.
Yeah. Because let's put together at night with that. So I connected in various ways.
Teaching one teaching it.
Yes, long time It is great. It's the best.
The whole fam. They take a portrait.
My Zoom camera is telling me more settings. Give me a break.
Guys, brother. No, put down for a second.
Make a nice one. Make a nice introduction. I'll do that, even though I am.
I was going to tell about the sign.
Not gonna leave the hall.
I'm afraid of offend people now.
That wasn't me, Brian. No, I am.
Writing, find time to write.
In case you need it. You have to make sure true. So, amazing. Wrong direction.
No, they're just getting smaller. We're gonna lose two people. I don't want to go yet. I don't want to go to Get ready to receive your dad. You got a pretty good rest.
Wide open front row. You got a scoot. Everyone knows who you are.
Even right now.
I just want to see Where did you get that
Second best to there was a receipt. You guys were showing tag.
Oh, yeah,
We were there last week.
That's
I'm not sure where I should stand. I see some sort of recording going on here that has a odd part of me on it. My head. Am I speaking clearly here? Am I being, is it auditory? Very good. Thank you. How's everyone today? So lovely to see all of you on Leap Day before spring break. One of my favorite constructions in the English language, spring break. Almost as good as upgrade. It is my good and great fortune that on a day in early August of 1992, I would meet the person who would become our colleague and my dear friend, a person whose presence on this campus would have the hugest of impacts on our writing community, the university at large, and me personally. I am so pleased on behalf of the English Department and Program in Creative Writing for asking me to introduce Michael Parker this afternoon, some 31 and a half years after our first meeting. It is likely Michael and I hold different recollections of our first encounter. The essential difference, Michael might say, between poets and fiction writers. Neither of us, however, engaged in those vocations are the most trustworthy collectors of memories, so I'll pursue. In my version of events, as two newly minted but somewhat mature visiting assistant professors, we are standing on the huge covered polished concrete portico of the former McKeever building, smoking cigarettes. He is wearing a seersucker jacket. Where do we go on here? He is wearing a seersucker jacket, a light-colored shirt, and white khakis, and is very tan from his summer. He is sporting a short haircut like Mark Harmon in NCIS that made me wonder if he had been in the Navy or Coast Guard. One of us had bummed a cigarette from the other, or maybe we got them from Jim Clark, who smoked enormous Benson and Hedges menthols. I'm sure Michael would recall it as my bumming one from him, because he would often remark, poets bum cigarettes from fiction writers. It is as he says. And over all these years, I bummed more than cigarettes from Michael. His dedication and rigorous commitment to teaching and writing have been an inspiration, not merely to me, but to our colleagues, and most especially our students, both undergraduate and MFA. For the many years we worked together, he preceded me in every marker of our time here and let me bum from him whatever it was I needed. I know Michael best as friend and writer and colleague. I can't recollect if I ever sat in on one of his classes, perhaps maybe to write a departmental observation, but maybe not even then. Certainly I knew from overhearing the students that he was a thorough and generous teacher who did not tender slackers, clock watchers, or narcissists gladly. I wear an invisible bracelet that is inscribed WWMD, not word weapons of mass destruction, but what would Michael do? I decided to ask some of Michael's former students to comment from their experiences on the battle lines. Jesse Van Reenen writes, sitting in Michael's classroom or office, I always felt we were peering inside stories and novellas, listening to their particular rhythm. Michael would find that moment in a story, a scene, a paragraph, a single sentence, where the sound lived, where the language came together with the heart of the piece. I'd leave every conversation filled with ideas, not to mention detailed marginalia from Michael, feeling clearer, more fearless in what I wanted to do, even as I had the space to figure out just how to make it happen on the page. It's that sensibility, Michael's way of reading and seeing and opening up a story, that never leaves me. Evan Fackler wrote to me, I was afraid of him at first. I don't think that fear really dissipated until I'd gotten through my first story critique in his workshop, and I read his critique letter, which was very winning and funny and insightful, even when he was giving me a hard time about having one of my characters use the word frictive. On a different story, Michael let me know I had failed, but I had done so admirably. But there was always the sense in his feedback that Michael was in your corner, that he was going to be as generous and thoughtful in his guidance on your story as he could, but also that he could see and appreciate the strengths of what you were doing or trying to do on the page. Maggie Cooper answers, what I remember most about working with Michael is the way he manages to be simultaneously exacting and genuinely kind, a combination that always made me want to live up to his expectations. The qualities that make Michael an excellent teacher are the same things that makes his writing so compelling. Those high standards, his commitment to finding and naming what is true, and his willingness to acknowledge that while both writing and life may never get easier, that is also what make both worth working at. And from Drew Perry, Michael taught me the music of prose, and that problems that are seemingly based in plot are often rhythmic. For existence, what's wrong with a conversation on the page might not be what's being said, but that there are two or few too many beats. He taught us that paragraphs rise and fall like stories, that sentences expand and contract like poetic lines. He read our work back to us, and in his unmistakable voice, we could hear what was right, thank God, and what still needed work. See, he'd say, you hear that? And we did. He also took me out one time to tell me to quit writing stories with talking giraffes in them. Drew, he said, cut that shit out. As you all know, perhaps, Michael is the author of 8 novels, Hello Down There, Towns Without Rivers, Virginia Lovers, If You Want Me to Stay, The Watery Part of the World, All I Have in This World, Prairie Fever, and I Am the Light of This World, and 3 collections of stories. His short fiction and nonfiction have appeared in numerous publications, the 5 Points, the Georgia Review, New York Times, Washington Post, Oxford American, Trail Runner, Runner's World, and Men's Journal. He's received fellowships in fiction from the North Carolina Arts Council and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Hobson Award for Arts and Letters, the North Carolina Award for Literature, and the 2020 Thomas Wolfe Prize. His work has been anthologized in the Pushcart and New Stories from the South anthologies, and he's a 3-time winner of the O. Henry Award. Michael Parker's love of sentences and all their attendant parts, from the clause to the semicolon, is exemplified in each of his novels, stories, and essays. He knows it is structure that also makes the story. To call this event the last lecture has a bit of melodrama about it. And as I was composing my words, I tried to avoid a sense of living elegy for my friend. Actually, I wrote eulogy here rather than elegy. Because Michael Parker is an active reader and speaker at campuses, bookstores, libraries, and venues throughout the country and this state he loves. He certainly will be giving many lectures, perhaps elsewhere, but certainly returning frequently to our campus to read from the new books he will write and that we will be gladly anticipating.
As to the first part of your introduction, I think we know who the greater fiction writer is. I appreciate that, Stuart, and I really appreciate how expansive it was, because I think we're about to run out of time.
Okay, yeah.
I really thank you all for coming. What's that? You bummed, you're just a bum, Stuart, what can I say? I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Paul and everyone else involved in bringing me here. I'm terrified of the word lecture. I don't know that I've ever given a lecture in my life. So instead, what I thought I would do is just talk to you I thought about giving my hour-long lecture on the imitated fallacy, which is a real crowd pleaser. But I changed my mind at the last minute and thought I would just talk about my time here at UNCG among you people, a lot of you who I see in the audience. And and that's it. And also, I assume that you know, before we start, how dicey a prospect it is to ask a fiction writer to opine on the subject of the past, or actually anything. The risk is not only exaggeration, or let's call it amplification, but in this case, nostalgia, which actually I just learned last night in Russian refers only to place. It doesn't refer to time. So, which I thought was fascinating. I was watching a Tarkovsky movie, and that's what I learned. Anyway, so most of what I'm going to talk about today is cast in a kind of glow of evening hour glow of retrospection. So pardon me for the nostalgia. Don't expect a whole lot in the way of fact, but do expect me to traffic in feeling. I came to UNCG in 1992 as a visitor, as a visiting professor. The writer Deborah Monroe had just announced her departure rather late in the semester, and I got a call from a former classmate from my undergraduate days at UNC Chapel Hill, who was enrolled in the MFA program here. Paul Shepard knew I had a novel coming out and had mentioned me as a possible replacement. I put my name in the hat, and I heard from Jim Evans that they wanted to interview me. And I remember arriving early and parking on Tate Street, when you could park on Tate Street, directly across from the McKeever building, and wandering around campus worrying over the various ways in which I might blow this interview. I made a list of stupid things not to say, and I prepped myself with a lot of pretentious declarations about form and quotes from William Gass, which of course were just more stupid things to say. After meeting with the two Jims, Evans and Clark, and having a delightful chat with Lee Zacharias in the old MFA office in McKeever, I went to lunch with Evans, Clark, and Fred Chappell. We dined at a place called Crocodiles, which I think now is Sushi Republic, which had a baby crocodile in an aquarium by the restrooms. Such was my introduction to the Gothic weirdness that was Greensboro in the 1990s. And it was really, it was very weird. And I'm from North Carolina, but Greensboro was very weird then. I had a student who came from New York, and she was here for about a month. She said, I think I finally understand Flannery O'Connor. I can't remember what we talked about, but I do remember realizing that they really just wanted to get a good look at me. This should have made me less nervous. I did not have to trot out that William Gass quote I had in reserve, but the waiter came around to take our drink orders, and someone, I think it was Jim Evans, suggested that I go first. It was lunch, mind you, but a kind of working lunch, and it was the 90s and late May, and I had worked up a terrible thirst from nerves. I could have really used a beer, but it was a job interview. The only job I'd ever had before this was a visiting writer position at Lynchburg College, and I was hired over the telephone. I had 3 seconds to decide whether or not it was safe to order a beer. This is how naive I was. I pretended to look over the menu as if I were trying to decide between sweet and Long Island iced tea. Finally, I ordered an Amstel Light. Everyone else ordered a drink or a couple, and I thought I had passed a very important test. Many years later, I mentioned this lunch to Jim Clark and how nervous I was about ordering a beer, and he said, "You mean a light beer?" I got the job and was given my teaching assignment, which for the first semester was 3 sections of a course called English 105, Intro to Narrative, which I'm sure you're still familiar with, which is still being taught, right? I hope so. It satisfied a general college requirement and was supposedly filled with students who were scared off by English 106, Intro to Poetry. I spent the summer reading books on narratology and copying everything I found into a notebook, which swelled into 90 single-spaced pages. I wrote out long lectures on various theories of narrative, most of them concocted by Russians. I read long narrative poems. I was thinking that I would teach the Epic of Gilgamesh and plays and movies and anything else which I thought qualified as narrative. At some point, I mentioned my preparation to a colleague who said, yeah, actually, that's just a survey course in the short story. I should say that I continued to teach this course well past my 25-year mark, and I loved it. The course drew students from many disciplines as opposed to the creative writing classes, which tended to be made up of humanities majors. Never did I get to teach half of the volleyball team in a fiction workshop. There was also the spark lit by one's first brush with great literature. I taught it as a close reading class for students who, for the most part, did not much care to read. We read a lot, way too much, a couple of stories a week, plus a novel or two at the end of the semester, and I made every other rookie mistake possible. In my first year here, I taught a section of 105 in Eberhard, the old science building. My daughter, who was 3 years old then, went to daycare down at the end of McKeever Street. Final exam day came, and I was running late. I brought my daughter to class, handed out the blue books, and gave my instructions. Then I went to drop Emma off at daycare. One of my colleagues was incredulous when I admitted to leaving the class unproctored for 20 minutes. But I trusted my students, and it turned out well, for the exams were no better nor worse than the next section. My first experience teaching creative writing had been as a graduate student at UVA. At UVA, the students were well-mannered and wore expensive footwear. They were smart and quick to answer questions, and their interest in the class was keen. On the first day of class, a student came up to me and said, "What do I have to do to make an A in this class?" I replied with the only proper answer to that question, which is never, ever, ever, ever say that again. In all my years here at UNCG, I never got that question. I will say more later about the distinct characteristics of the students here, but one thing that was a thrill to discover was that they were far more comfortable with ambiguity. I'm not sure why this is the case, but over the years, I attribute it to the fact that many were first-generation college students, worked hefty hours outside of school, and so understood the value of effort that they did not question a class in which things weren't right or wrong, but working or not working. Another thing I loved about the students here was that they weren't generally what is known as well-adjusted. The least desirable thing for a writer to be is well-adjusted. After a year in a national search, I got hired for a tenure-track position. The circumstances of my hiring were a little fraught, but came down to a simple misunderstanding. The committee said that they wanted to bring 3 people to campus, but they did not mention that they also wanted to interview me because I was already on campus. So the chair called me in and told me that I didn't make the cut. I confess I was crushed because I loved this place immediately. Years earlier, I had published my first story in the Greensboro Review, and I applied to and was accepted into the program. Greensboro did not give me any money. I'm still sort of angry about that a little bit. And the University of Virginia did, so I went where the money was. The only time following the money turned out well for me, as I would not have gotten the job if I'd been a student here, seeing as how we do not hire our own. So it all worked out for the better. Thank you, UNCG, for not giving me any money to go to school. The committee figured out what had happened, and I got an interview. I remember floundering a bit when the wonderful and late Don Darnell asked me a question about Mark Twain. I said something so fatuous, it still makes me cringe, that Twain had invented American vernacular speech. but the other candidates must have floundered more because I got the job. There was no office space available on the first floor, so I was sent up to the second floor with the historians. First, in a windowless, partitioned off classroom across the hall from an adjunct whose enthusiasm for the Civil War was audible through the wall. Bill Tucker retired the next year, and I was given his office, also on the history floor. My inherited office had many interesting features: a case of whiteout, several hole punchers, a pencil sharpener nailed to a bookcase, and the HVAC register blew hot air in the summer and cold in the winter. I was instructed to call the physical plant to fix the problem, but I decided against it when I learned that my office hours were affected by the climate. Visits tended to be short when you could see your breath or soak your shirt with sweat. McKeever by that point was a wreck, but it had its odd pleasures. The central courtyard doubled as a sculpture garden for the art department. This sunlit space proved a great place to smoke and deconstruct a department meeting with Russ McDonald, who patiently explained to me what I had just voted for or against. There were a handful of smokers among the faculty, and these were the folks that I knew the best. By the turn of the century, we had all come to our senses and quit smoking, and I took great pleasure in getting to know the rest of the faculty. I had been here a year or two when I had the idea, borrowed from Alderman Library at UVA, to mount an exhibit and special collections of past writers and former students of note who had spent time at UNCG. I wrote a note to Emily Mills, who was then the director of special collections. Some weeks went by without a reply, and I was told that campus mail was not that reliable. So I walked over to the library to see if she had received my note. "I sent you an email about it," said Emily. "Oh, I don't have email," I told her. She explained that everyone had an email account, that you were assigned an email account when you became a faculty member. I went back to my office and asked Warren Rochelle, who was then assistant director of the writing program, to help me figure out this email situation. He got me logged in, and of course there were hundreds of emails, most of them from the English department, but a half dozen from a college who wanted me to come give a reading, ranging in tone from warmly inviting to deeply indignant that I had not deigned to respond. Emily was excited about the project, and so I set about trying to put it together. I decided to limit it to writers who had published at least one book, as opposed to many stories or poems in excellent journals, thinking that this would narrow the scope. I worked with Jim Clark and Fred Chappell and Bob Watson and Lee Zacharias to compile a list. When it approached the length of a novella, I began to panic. Was there room for all these books and manuscript pages? What if I left someone out? That was what I was really worried about. What if I left someone out? Also, how was it possible that one writing program had produced so many fine writers? We decided to put out a pamphlet to accompany the exhibit called Sleeping Beauty, which took its name from a quote by Randall Jarrell. When someone asked him why UNCG, then Women's College, had turned out so many writers, he pointed to the campus and said, "See, it's Sleeping Beauty." The pamphlet included a history of the program written by my research assistant at the time, Maria Hummel, the novelist and poet. Maria did a fantastic job with this assignment, but there was another assignment around this time that, due to poor communication on my part, caused some problems. I was asked to judge the Sir Walter Raleigh Award for Fiction and had narrowed it down to 5 semifinalists. I asked Maria to call the publishers of each book and let them know that their authors had made the short list. Maria misunderstood and told each publisher that their authors had won the award. Last spring, Maria was here to celebrate Fred, and she and I had a good laugh about this incident and the vitriol that followed when I had to call the publishers up and take back all the prizes. The library exhibit was one of the high points of my time here, mostly because I got to learn a lot about the history of the program and its illustrious visiting writers. One of the writers in attendance told me about being in a workshop led by Alan Tate. Tate did not speak much in class, and the way to tell if he liked the poem you read aloud was if he thumped the ashes of his cigarette. All eyes were on the cigarette as the student read their poems. The longer the ash, the better the poem. Another esteemed faculty member had a student who tended to hold forth with much enthusiasm, but not much content and zero sense of audience. Rather than shut him down, the faculty member leaned down to laboriously tie and retie his shoelaces every time this fellow spoke. I taught here for almost 28 years, and I still have no answer to that mystery of Sleeping Beauty, why UNCG has produced so many great writers. Bob Watson, elaborating on Jarrell's remark, said it was a great place to get your work done because there weren't many distractions, but most writers I know could find a distraction living off the grid in Saskatchewan. There were people who made it easy. Jim Clark ran the program with an almost invisible hand, and it ran smoothly. We never had meetings because if an issue arose, we figured it out in random encounters in the hallways of McKeever. The hallway was the only option to confer with Jim, as the only chair in his office besides his desk chair was piled high with books and papers to discourage visitors. Jim had devised a rather complicated system of rating the applicants. As I remember, the categories went something like this: definitely no, not really, maybe no, maybe yes, yes, strong yes, and yes with an exclamation point, which we all called, oh, hell yes. When Holly was hired, she helped us simplify our system to a much more simple, sensical no, maybe, yes. When new faculty came and questioned some part of our system, I was just as guilty as the next person in saying, oh, but it's always been done this way. Some of our ways were almost as old as Jim Clark's Hog's Breath Saloon t-shirt, which he wore on Fridays years before Dress Down Fridays was a thing. Of course, a part of the mystery of Sleeping Beauty was due to the stellar faculty. Jim and his steadily excellent staff of assistants at the helm, Fred and Lee on the fiction side, Tom Kirby Smith, Alan Shapiro, who took Bob Watson's line when he retired, and of course Stuart on the poetry side. Stuart and I arrived as visitors in 1992. This is where our memories depart slightly. And my first sight of him was in a general faculty meeting in the alumni room. He was looking behind him, trying to locate the back door. I knew from the start we would be pals because I had already scoped out a quick exit before I even sat down. I was intimidated by the crew I joined, and were I to get hired here tomorrow, I would be just as intimidated by the overwhelming talent of the present faculty, some of whom I did not get the chance to teach with, but all of whom I know through their stellar work. That work is made possible in part by the steadfast guidance and support of Terry Kennedy and Jesse Van Renen, who have done much to keep the original vision alive and bring it into the digital age. And there were those teachers who came before me, Randall Jarrell, of course, and Peter Taylor. Peter Taylor is a particular favorite and a writer whose work deserves a place, to my mind, alongside Eudora Welty and Elizabeth Bowen. Mr. Taylor's papers went to Harvard, where he taught before coming to Greensboro, but his wife, Women's College alum Eleanor Ross Taylor, donated a couple of boxes of manuscripts to special collections with instructions that they not be opened until a certain date. Janice Pardue, who worked for years in special collections, knew how much of a Peter Taylor fan I was, invited me over for the opening of the boxes. She allowed me to lift the first spiral notebook out of the box, and I opened it to find one of my favorite of Taylor's stories, Venus, Cupid, Folly, and Time, in faint pencil with only a few insertions in the margins, as if he got it right the first time. I would be lying if I denied trying to figure out how to accidentally misplace that notebook in my backpack. But alas, the not so sleepy beauty of our special collections is that the rich archives are available to everyone. And it is my hope that no budget cut ever deny a student the experience of looking at the faintly penciled draft of a masterpiece. I got the chance to teach Peter Taylor when, between the retirement of Charles Davis and the arrival of Scott Romine, I was tapped to teach both graduate and undergraduate classes in Southern fiction. I like Faulkner and Welty and O'Connor as much as the next serious writer, but I suspect the reason I was chosen to teach this course over someone with a more sound critical background was because of my accent. Is that right, Scott? Over the years, my teaching load shifted more to graduate students as we added classes in creative nonfiction and continued to offer the course in structure of fiction to both poets and fiction writers in the program. Structure of fiction was one of my favorite classes because it gave me a chance to work with the poets who I'd previously known only through Thursday afternoon happy hour, and it allowed me to teach whoever and whatever I wanted. I taught works by Faulkner, Flaubert, Garcia Marquez, Toni Morrison, Cormac McCarthy, Malcolm Lowry, Glenway Westcott, William Gass, Peter Handke, Jean Toomer, Zora Neale Hurston. I'm just going to read everyone I taught. Okay? Catherine M. Porter, Lydia Davis, Mary Robeson, Marguerite Duras, Michael Ondaatje, Maggie Nelson, Mary Gaitskill, Virginia Woolf, Muriel Spark, Herta Mueller, Joseph Skoricki, Juan Rulfo, Evan Cannell. What other course conceivable would allow for such an expansive syllabus? I feel like the luckiest man alive to have taught that course for so long in so many iterations. I taught it as a novella course. I taught it as a course in a short novel. I taught it in terms of group to subject matter, but mostly we just talked about form. Anyway, I had been midway through graduate school when critical theory began to influence literary studies. My idea of a literary critic then, and I confess now, were writer critics like Elizabeth Hardwick or V.S. Pritchett, or more public intellectuals like Malcolm Cowley or Lionel Trilling. About the most avant-garde I got was Wayne Booth. In her book, The Possessed, Adventures with Russian Books and People Who Read Them, the novelist Elif Batuman writes of her own literary apprenticeship, it was a received idea in those days that theory was bad for writers, infecting them with a hostility toward language and making them turn out postmodern. And what did it have to offer anyway, besides the reduction of a novel to a set of unpleasant facts about power structures, or the superficial thrill of juxtaposing Pride and Prejudice with the uncertainty principle? Talking about sentence rhythm was foreign to many of my students who had been schooled to think in terms of signifiers. Rather than learn what seemed to me a foreign tongue, I forced my close reading on a couple of generations of students with a now embarrassing rectitude. When I finally got around to reading Derrida, I found him funny, which I was not expecting. My teaching of literature courses would have benefited from a wider critical stance, but I maintained that any workshop should not privilege the thematic, but get at it through structural choices designed to enhance it. Close attention to syntax is not likely to hurt a young writer, even if they maintain that style is a fixed and determinate element and not a series of notes to bend and slur as dictated by subject. One thing I discovered over my 3 decades of teaching graduate students was that certain popular writers wielded a sizable influence and were somewhat dangerous to teach because they were so likely to be imitated. When I was in graduate school, it was either the so-called minimalists, Raymond Carver, Tobias Wolff, Ann Beattie, and Mary Robeson, or postmodern maximalists like Robert Coover, John Barth, William Gaddis. By the time I got to Greensboro, it was Lorrie Moore, Cormac McCarthy, Dennis Johnson, and later George Saunders. All these writers are exemplary and quite different, but there is something about them stylistically that leads to rampant imitation. I remember teaching Dennis Johnson's story Work from a mimeograph of the original New Yorker, where it was published long before Jesus' Son came out. It was no surprise that Johnson's vein of druggy, booze-soaked stories hit home with a certain ilk of our undergraduates in the 90s, because most of these stories could have been set at New York Pizza. I kept on teaching him despite the tendency to ape him, because by his own admission, much of his dazzling and slightly surreal imagery comes straight out of Isaac Babel's Red Cavalry. And teaching Johnson alongside Babel proved to be an effective demonstration of a distillation and strategic selection of influence. Perhaps the biggest effect on my students' work was not a book. At some point, Nearly overnight, every other story was nonlinear, whether it needed to be or not. I was perplexed, but flattered that my push for different structural choices had such an impact until Stuart and I went to see Pulp Fiction. And I figured out that Quentin Tarantino was behind the curtain. On the undergraduate level, the students were much more resistant to influences due to their reading taste. Their stories might have been less polished than the work I encountered at UVA and during my brief time at UT Austin, but they were more honest and far more memorable. They reflected what I can only call real life experience. Often this experience was filtered through what used to be called genre fiction, fantasy, horror, speculative, and in later years, fan fiction. Workshops and creative writing programs back in the day were biased against genre, privileging the literary over all. What was and was not literary was determined by anthologies like Best American Short Stories, or more often and worse, the taste of the faculty. I am glad to hear that this has been corrected. Nevertheless, I confess it was a challenge for me to teach in the days of Harry Potter and Game of Thrones. Where are you in all of this was a refrain I leveled at every other student during conferences. Feel free to adopt any conventions you want, but what did the dragons and vampires do for us emotionally? Were these the wrong questions to ask? I don't know. I think actually that they were. Many times in the last 5 years did I question the plot of the story, only to be told by the class that it was a spinoff of a video game. I believe every teacher comes with an expiration date, and for me, the inability to retain cultural currency was a sign that I was past due. I'm going to read that again. I believe every teacher comes with an expiration date, and for me, the inability to retain cultural currency was a sign that I was past due. More and more, I relied on my graduate assistants to bring in stories that the undergrads might relate to better than Isaac Babel or even Dennis Johnson. No matter how out of touch I felt, the students were always a delight. Well, okay, not always. Anyone who tells you that every student they've taught is a delight is likely a fiction writer and not a very good one at that. But the delight in trying out new approaches to storytelling, the grappling with the very nature of narrative, and the fiery discussions that erupted in workshops and lit classes, this is what I miss. Teaching in the low residency program at Warren Wilson has ample rewards, but this email situation is not comparable to the windowless and often smelly seminar rooms we were always fighting over up on the third floor. Back to the graduate program. Funding was then and is ever more so crucial. In a climate where humanities are being marginalized, if not cut altogether, outside support is all the more important. Our program, lacking the often single donor millions that have made Texas and Michigan so enduring, has had to be scrappy to endure. The relationship with the English department has always been cordial. The fight for assistantships and tuition waivers is a yearly battle, though, as is funding for the Greensboro Review and for necessities like a budget for visiting writer visits. A visiting writer series is a necessary component for any creative writing program. And back in the day, we were able to bring writers like Seamus Heaney, Louise Glick, Colin McCann, James McBride, Chris Abani, and dozens of others to read, teach workshops, and mingle with the students. The battle for funding is wearisome and takes away energy that could best be spent on the students and their needs. Though the students come first, and our unique tutorial system ensures that they get the kind of close attention to their work that they need, they deserve better in the way of financial support. Why am I saying this? I'm preaching to the choir. Let me add my twangy tenor to the chorus. That's all I'm saying. I know you all feel the same way. I would be remiss if I did not say a few words about Fred Chappell. When I would see Fred and Susan over the years since Fred retired 20 years ago, they always spoke of the program as if they were still a part of it. It was never, how are y'all doing with the Jarrell Fellowship or the Enrichment Fund, but how are we doing? Their queries always came from a place of devotion and dedication to an institution to which Fred and Susan have been linked for nearly 60 years. The loss of Fred was a huge one, as was the passing of Jim Clark a few years ago. They put this program on the map and kept it there for many years, some of them frightfully lean. I realize that most of this talk has been anecdotal, and there's a reason for this. When I think of my time here, it's the stories that I remember, and that's not just because I'm a storyteller. Our strength has always been in particular moments of being, and those moments have accrued over the last 60-odd years in a way that defies metrics. Methods of quantifying success are meaningless when we neglect to take into account the experience that has been, that is, and that will be UNCG. Thank you very much. Am I being recorded? Oh. Should I have looked in that thing?
No. There was some
Happy
people
to-
that wanted to see that couldn't
It was
make
a
it, so they're
stream.
streaming.
Oh, a stream. Oh,
Yes.
an internet thing.
Yes. I typed into that email thing.
I got it. The email internet thing. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Or if anyone's interested or not, we could just go eat some cheese and drink some punch and tell.
We're gonna have a reception up on the 3rd floor after this. Please, everyone come.
Light beer, I understand.
Light beer, yeah. No cigarettes. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And also I will just add that, if you parked in the Oakland deck as the signs directed you to do, we don't have exit tickets, but they will be open from 5:30 to 7. So you don't need an exit pass.
I went all the way around.